and Mary Jo. Very nice. I see Peter Filkins, who's going to talk in a few weeks. So very nice. Yeah.
It's Jeffrey Harrison. I haven't seen
Oh
him.
yeah. A nice group today. Um, so Lawrence, or I know you told me, and I could call you Larry. The first question we always have is how have some of the themes of 2020, the pandemic, racial injustice, income inequality, and then things that have really kind of just bubbled over into 2021, January 6th at the Capitol, obviously a new president. Have any of those themes showed up in your work?
Well, my kind rarely begin with an event, a recent actual event. They rarely begin with an idea. Almost always the poems begin with some piece of language that I want, that I feel I can do something with, that can take me somewhere. And I wouldn't know where. I would try to surprise myself into whatever the concerns of the poem might be. And then as the poem develops, whatever the identifiable ideas of the poem might be. So I guess I would have to say specifically those recent events in American history, world history, are not something that I believe, except one exception, which is a poem that I will read. But in general, I wouldn't start with something there. I would hope that they would find their way into the poems later, and that then I could manage them in whatever context it was that the poem set up. If I were to say, okay, I want to write a poem about the attack on the Capitol, I'm not sure where that would begin, how I would relate to that beyond saying, it was awful, it was terrible, Trump this, Trump that. I remember there's something that William Butler Yeats said or wrote once, and I think I'm getting it almost correct. He said, out of quarrels with others, we make rhetoric. Out of quarrels with ourselves, we make poetry. And I found all that to be useful, since a poem is a way of addressing yourself, of wondering about your own attitudes and feelings and so on, and then how they relate to the world.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. Yeah, I like that Yeats quote.
Yeah, it's great.
So, so I think you just talked about it, but so most often a poem would start with a piece of language. Is that you reading something or hearing a conversation or?
Well, it could be those. I sometimes have kept notebooks and written down interesting things that I have heard. And I often do find myself reading poems before I start writing them. I think I found myself especially doing that when I was teaching, and my mind was full of the language of writing comments on student papers, which is not really the best way of getting into a poem. So I would try to think about, to immerse myself briefly in someone else's poetry, not to copy it, but just to put my mind in that place. But yeah, I think in general, and certainly recently, I would begin with a sentence that had, well, what Robert Frost called a sentence sound. And I'm thinking of as tone of voice, a sentence that has and intriguing tones, which suggests that some person is saying this. And then I can wonder, like, what else might that person say? Is there somebody listening to this? What sort of situation is behind it? So that would be a small clue that might lead me to lots of other things. And then along the way, things could get changed. For a while, not so long ago, I used to, and still sometimes do, go through a newspaper and just underline things that people said that seemed to me interesting, that I could take, in most cases, out of the context of whatever the article was about. And I would try to forget the actual circumstances surrounding whoever said that. So I wouldn't usually turn to statements by politicians or famous world leaders, but articles that in which people are simply quoted as saying X or Y about some often domestic issue. And then I would steal that line, might change it, and I would see where I could take it. So again, I think the process for me is almost a kind of process of detection. You know, I have my clue and I want to see where I can go with it. And I want to discover things that I didn't know when I started the poem. I want the poem to, as Frost once said, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. So I would like the reader to be surprised when they move through a poem of mine. And I believe Frost in saying that. So I want to surprise myself.
Nice, very nice. So after, well, I guess almost 38 weeks of this program, I think almost every poet has shared with us that a poem may be temporarily finished, but is basically maybe waiting on the sidelines for another go at it. So how do you know, you put books together, how do you know when a poem would be, complete for you, if it could be complete?
Yeah. Well, a quick answer to that, and a true answer, but perhaps not a very interesting answer, is to say, by instinct, that after years and years of writing, you have a sense that the poem is complete when you get to a certain point. But that doesn't really answer your question. I have thought that one way of moving toward that, of developing that instinct, was always for me to say that a poem is done when it doesn't need me anymore. When I can set it out into the world and I won't want to explain anything. When you start developing a poem, a lot of things that aren't really yet in the poem. And some of those things should be in the poem and a whole lot of them shouldn't. The process of making the poem is in part discovering what the poem needs from you and what it doesn't need. When those decisions are made, then you can send the poem out to strangers and trust, if you're working well, that the poem contains everything it needs to be understood by a stranger in the way you want the poem to be understood. And there are obviously lots of different ways that lots of different poets have, but I think that remains true. The poem needs to reveal itself without any intercession from me.
Fantastic. Thank you. So let's listen to you reading some of your poems.
Okay, John, thank you. And thanks to everybody who is tuned in. I want to begin with a poem called a children's story. It was originally begun to go how do poems begin, with one day before dinner, I was trying to amuse my grandson Noah, and I wanted us to write a little story together. So we did. With illustrations, it took 10 minutes, and it had some charm to it. And I came upon it later, and I thought, as I was just saying to you, John, I thought I can do something with this. I can do more with this than just have it be this little story that Noah and I worked on together. So that's where the poem started. It's in 4 numbered sections, and it's called A Children's Story. 1. A man was walking in the rain when he found a dog. He took the dog home. The dog was glad to be out of the rain. The man gave the dog a bowl of water, and the dog fell asleep by the fire. Then a boy knocked on the door and asked the man if he'd seen his dog. No, said the man. The boy started to cry. Okay, the man said, I have your dog, but right now the dog is sleeping. Why don't you wait for a while? No, the boy said. It's late and I have to go home. 2. The man stood on his porch watching them leave. He wasn't sure how to feel. A bird flew down and perched on the railing. Listen to me, the bird said. That boy just tricked you. His dog isn't really his dog. The man found the boy and took the dog. The boy started to cry. The man said, you're not going to fool me this time. 3. On the way home, a wolf came out of the woods. The wolf said, that bird was lying to you. Why would a bird do that? Asked the man. Nature is all deception, replied the wolf. Look at me. I'm not going to eat you. I just came to tell you the truth. The wolf headed back into the woods, and the man and the dog went home. The dog fell asleep by the fire. 4. But the man kept wondering, who should I believe? What should I do? Pay attention to me, said the fire. Everything I touch, I have to destroy. What kind of answer is that? Asked the man. But the fire had said all that it wanted to say. Then the dog woke up and went over to the man and sat down beside him. Look at me, the dog said, without speaking. Look at me and I will help you understand. The man stared into the dog's eyes. You will never know, the dog said, to whom I belong.
Oh, fantastic.
I used to, when I used to tell my writing students when I was teaching, only half in jest, I said, any poem can be improved by including a dog. And then I would add, and it's even better if the dog speaks.
Oh boy.
And sometimes that worked. They tried it out. Here's a little poem. These poems are all from this new book that Tupelo will bring out next year. Book is called, as I think Wendy mentioned, April at the Ruins. And this poem is called in the earliest days, and the title runs into the first stanza. In the earliest days, death and chance were brothers, and suffering didn't turn anyone into a better person. What happened, happened. The sun vanished and returned. For a while, everyone was more afraid than usual. Perhaps this was a sign, but of what? No one had yet learned how to wonder about such things. All of the world was only itself. So the night must have been magnificent in its loneliness, and the dawn a kind of rapture we can't imagine. All right, now I'm going to read the poem that's anomalous amongst my poems, at least. It's the poem that does respond to an actual event, actually two events, one of which is the pandemic. And the pandemic is both the background for what else happens in the poem. But by the end, I hope it becomes an important metaphor for what's been happening in the poem. The poem is called What We Did Yesterday. What we did yesterday. We woke later than usual, opened the shades, looked out at the lawn. We wrote to friends who needed to be told that our dog, Lucy, had died the day before. In the afternoon, we drove to the store and waited until the groceries we'd ordered were carried out to the car, since the virus had reached us. And this was one of the ways we could try to be safe. At home, we washed our hands and started picking up her toys. Water bowls, beds, some to discard, some to give away, a few her collar, her blue rabbit, to leave where they were for a while. Toward evening, we took a walk, keeping our distance as required from the people we passed. You said, we were fortunate the end had been sudden. Yesterday morning, only yesterday, she was so weak. We could see she'd never be herself again. The look in her eyes was like my father's when he was dying. It said, something terribly wrong is happening inside me, which is why I must concentrate only on that. We carried her downstairs and made the arrangements. The first injection put her to sleep. The second stopped her heart. We stroked her gently as though she could feel our touch. I wanted to cry, but didn't. And then we went home. Isolation, we'd been told, is crucial to flatten the curve, slowing the progress of the virus, which might mean thousands wouldn't die. But we should expect to be alone much longer than predicted, to stay in the house, to leave only if we needed to accomplish some necessary task. So you see the pandemic is part of the fabric of the poem as it was of our lives at that moment, but I wouldn't say it's a poem about the pandemic in the way I would say it's a poem about Lucy's death. Okay, next. Okay, this is a poem with a famous title by a famous poet. It's called Stopping by Woods. And I'm happy to have Robert Frost's poem inform my poem, but it's still my poem. So you'll notice that I've left out of the title On a Snowy Evening. So that will distinguish between the two poems. Stopping by Woods. Imagine you're out there also in the snow, not far from those trees that seem to be hiding something. Maybe you're concerned another traveler, even this late, might see you and stop and ask why you stopped. If you're having some kind of trouble, what would you say? What would you keep to yourself? A few minutes ago, you weren't uneasy. Now you are. And maybe there's a reason, maybe there isn't. But this is a poem. It's not life where nothing has to add up, which is why you expect you'll be given by the end some useful idea about duty or time to take home and ponder. Yet the snow has disguised so much. You're not sure how long you should wait, and you're tired, aren't you? Watching the snow, lovely as it is, falling and continuing to fall. Okay, this is a poem with a much less good title. In fact, I can never remember the title of this poem, nor can my wife. And it has an epigraph to it from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So we always say, well, you know, the Wittgenstein poem. Why did I keep the title? I kept the title because it clicks in to the epigraph in a way that seems really nice to me. So here's the title, Why We Are Here, and then the epigraph, very short, and then the poem. Why we are here. I don't know why we are here, but I'm pretty sure it is not in order to enjoy ourselves. One afternoon in Vienna, almost by chance, you find yourself in front of the house where Wittgenstein once lived and considered the difficulties of knowing what we know. That was the summer you needed to decide about love, whether or not you were confusing it with affection. Soon her train would arrive, and she would step out onto the platform, smiling but anxious. So what sense does it make that Saint Francis has followed her into your thoughts? As a young man, Francis chose a life of pleasure. Then he found God, gave everything he owned to the poor, and was loved by the animals, which is why in many paintings he comforts a rabbit or a mouse, and why the birds flock to him to be blessed. But as you hurry toward the station, St. Francis turns into Venus, serenely poised on her shell above the waves. What happiness Botticelli must have felt to have created her luxurious hair and all the rest of her splendid body. Naturally, he loved her, emerging as she had from the labors of his art. Perhaps he hoped to be loved in return. Once, hadn't such things been possible? So you reach the station just as she steps from the train, her long hair brushed by the tenderness of the light of Vienna, and you're struck that this moment is like the beginning of a movie in which a man and woman meet on a train, fall in, then out of love, then rob a bank with such clumsiness they must want to be shot. And he is, but she doesn't care, not anymore, since not caring, she tells him, is all you get in this life to protect yourself. Well, that was depressing, your companion remarks, as the credits roll and the lights rise. We should have gone dancing, because if we aren't here to enjoy ourselves, why are we here? And she adds, you must realize, my friend, my sweet, my little mouse, the world cares for you just as much as I do, which right now isn't much. Such cruelty, however, could be the fault of a poor translation from the French. Since this conversation is happening inside a film, inside that other film about theft and betrayal and aimless disillusionment, all of it arranged to make the point that art is artifice and must be different from, or else the same as, what's real. Therefore, when the woman you've come to meet crosses the platform with that endearing skip and shrug, why not tell her you love her? And that seeing her now in this station is like the end of a long and perplexing story, full of apparently meaningless digressions that fall into place in the final chapter, leaving the reader astonished and overwhelmed. Okay. This one is a persona poem, meaning, of course, that it's not spoken by me, but written by me, but spoken by a character. You can imagine the character speaking the poem as an elderly man, I say again, not me, who is showing a visitor around the town that he has lived in all his life. The poem is called Hometown. Best to begin with Main Street. Our one barber shop, one good bakery, then that solitary school on its hilltop above the train station where someone I know by name will accept my ticket if I decide to leave. This is the town most of us have lived in forever, without worrying if we should live somewhere else or should want to. But why, you might ask, did we allow our elms, the ones that looked like they still had a chance, to be taken away? Why permit our fine old station to fall into ruin? Doors split, water staining the marble columns, as if each new traveler had to see, as you've seen, what happens to anything we assume we don't need. How permanent our carelessness turned out to be. After the mills failed, some of us left. You'd have left, wouldn't you, long before? Now the water's clear, people fish, and the Forsythia's just out, a brighter gold than I've ever seen. Before you leave, you might enjoy a walk along the river. The best way is down that hill beyond our fancy new hospital. Yes, it's ugly. I don't know why they couldn't have done better. Or why, every time I'm there, I wait even longer to be told what is or isn't wrong. I've learned not to think too far ahead, to let my thoughts slip outside and look for a better place. Maybe a garden where bumblebees are going about their business and a few women kneel among the flowers, chatting and weeding, one of them brushing her hair back when the breeze unloosens it. I don't pity us, and you shouldn't either. In the school, the children are adding and subtracting, but soon that part of their day will be over. And as they leave, they'll be laughing, telling each other jokes and secrets, and singing about what they purely love to hear. Nonsense, isn't it? Stepping on a crack, falling off a wall so hard, all the king's horses and all the king's men can never put you back together again. Okay, a few more. Let's see. Two more. This poem is called Lies. These are the days of insolence and denial, which aren't so different from the other days when God told us what to do and we didn't do it, which meant one plague after another until finally God gave up. He must have decided we'd never learn, had never even tried. The lies we believed, we wanted to believe, the choices we made returned as history, then left us with all these books of predictions and charts of losses, and the hopes of some that God might consent to punish us again, but with one of those lesser plagues, so we get to live and be contrite. This time, we would tell him, we've learned our lesson and are very sorry, and will never do what we did ever again. Okay, one or two more. This one is called In America. Even these days, I can sense it. The old allure of nature, as sweet and impermanent as winter's first snow, or the brilliance of the pear tree blossoming or that disk of sun on water, drifting away from itself, then back, briefly restored. Once it was possible to mistake silence for sympathy. And no one worried about where nature was going or what would happen when it got there. Moment by moment is how children move through the day. And if in fact they don't, I still want to see them out in the evening on the darkening lawns, released from thought. My friend Eric tells me that to an unencumbered mind, the acceptance of death is freedom. Equanimity, he writes, has become my dear companion. I believe him. I believe he's sure of it. But nostalgia often takes me back to a time when we might have invented a better place to live than where we live now. America, you were so eager and in love with yourself. How can we claim to be surprised that our grandfathers, fathers, overwhelmed by your endlessness, decided everything was theirs to take and name and keep? So they did, and taught us that anyone who stands in the way should have known better, that suffering is the cost of progress, that we are what we own. It's not difficult now to confess their sins and be burdened by almost nothing, even granted permission to congratulate ourselves on our honesty. Quiet concentration is what Eric says he tries to achieve without trying. No more neediness, no more striving. When I was a kid, I was given a gold star for being good and a silver one for just a little less. How pleased I was to see them beside my name on the bulletin board for the other children to look at and envy. Well, maybe I should end there, John.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. No, no, just fantastic, fantastic. I feel like I've been on a travelogue around the Vienna, America. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Those
So
places.
I'm going to make sure I don't do any lie to God in the next 24 hours, just in case there's any plague 2.0 coming. So no, really great,
Thank
very
you.
enjoyable. So when do you want to open it up for people to ask questions?
I do, but first I would just like to thank you for your very wonderful reading. I was very moved by several of your poems and enjoyed every word. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking.
I would like to invite our audience to ask questions or make comments. We have the chat box, which I'm happy to read out loud if people would prefer to ask their questions there. But also I invite you to unmute your mics and start your cameras if you would like to ask a question in a more traditional way. I see some people are starting their cameras up. It would be lovely to see everyone if you'd like to.
I've always noticed in actual readings where there's an actual audience in front of you that nobody ever wants to ask the first question. And then lots of people want to ask the second one. So I can't ask the first one. John already asked questions.
Elaine has a question.
Elaine, okay, great.
I have a question. I don't know how to get my face on there, which is probably the best.
Well, I'm
But-
going to invite you to start your video. Did something pop up for you?
No, but that's okay.
I can hear you, Elaine.
Okay, there you
There you
go.
are.
So I've known
Sorry.
Larry for so long, and I'm just wondering, when did you feel within yourself that you were a poet? When did that strike you, hit you,
Um,
envelop you?
well,
Huh.
when did I feel that I was, that I wanted to be a poet, or that I was a real practicing poet? So those are two related questions. I wanted to be a poet. I suppose the reason I wanted to be a poet, like many people, began with just self-indulgence. You know, I was lonely. I was sad. You know, you write poems. Maybe you do other things and it helps you. They're not good poems. So when I first felt that I was a real poet, or could be, was when I learned how to revise. Because it seems to me, as I always tell my students, that you don't know what your poem is about when you first write it. And why should you expect that what you put down right away is all you have to do, all you have to say, wherever you want to go? So keep re-envisioning the poem. And when I found that I could do that, both with pleasure and with some success for this or that poem, then I felt that I knew what being a poet was going to be like.
Wow.
Nice, yeah.
Thanks.
Lord, boy.
Uh,
That's a pretty wonderful response to a great question.
Absolutely.
Anyone else have questions or comments?
I would like to.
Sure, go ahead, Liz.
Okay. Thank you, Lawrence. This is Liz. Thank
Liz, I just wrote you this morning, right? Thanks.
you. This is so enjoyable. Wonderful. I'm going to be writing you an email about what I love. I have a question, and that is kind of a general question. I hope that's okay. Of what can poetry express that short stories and novels and plays cannot express?
Probably nothing.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think the answer to that. Deeper. Cuts deeper.
One thing you can say about a poem is bound shorter than a novel, or at least
Till the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
compared to most.
More if I leave?
Yes, of course.
So
Oh, no.
there's a kind of concentration that you look for in a poem.
Stayed that long.
It was wonderful.
Talking there, but okay, there's a kind of concentration in a poem, and even if the words of the poem are the same words of a novel or a short story, they will register differently because the poem is asking the reader to focus with a greater intensity upon them, word by word. I think in a novel or short story, a play, you're always going somewhere large. You're following a plot. Doesn't mean the language isn't terrific. Doesn't mean the language isn't better than a lot of poems, but you're still moving. You're moving out there with Captain Ahab looking for that white whale. And in a poem, you just have a little room maybe, and you can reread it, and you can put a lot of pressure on every word. So I guess I'd say that's the difference I can think of.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think, John Plant, you may have a question, and then there is a little comment in the chat box as well. But John, did you have a question?
I didn't really have a question. I just kind of wanted to express gratitude that this kind of thing exists. And I rarely get to hear Larry in person, except when we're together. But just to experience the poems in this way. And that led me to sort of connect with Liz's question, which is something about poems that when you hear a poem like this, every part of the poem can sort of, resonate with every other part of the poem, so that there's a real satisfaction when you reach the end. That you, in a novel, your satisfactions are always sort of provisional and being revised, and yet here in a poem they can have a kind of completeness, and it comes out particularly strongly when you're hearing them read.
Yes, that's a really nice point, John. John is an old friend of mine and a wonderful composer. But I think this point is that there's a singularity about a poem as a thing and as a moment in time that it creates for the reader. You would say that in a novel, there are many such moments, and they're being propelled along on different threads. But in the poem, as John was saying, yes, everything seems capable of reflecting on everything else. And every time you read the poem, and poems are, I hope, are designed to be read multiple times. Many poems, are designed not to reveal everything on a first reading, and to compel you or to lure you. I mean, it's especially true of Robert Frost, back into the poem, so that you can, even in some ways, correct your initial reading. So there's this a kind of intimate negotiation between poem and reader within a relatively small space of materials, but also a relatively long space of time.
I think that's where like assonance and metaphor, rhyme comes in. It's a short enough medium that all those techniques can kind of knit the whole thing together into a really satisfying, cohesive whole, that maybe a novel doesn't have.
Well, yes, absolutely. And formal structures are what, I say that without being one who uses them, but formal structures are there that allow us to keep the poem in our mind and return to it, so that we can re-experience it in our own imagination, eventually without even looking at the page.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be formal structure so much as maybe a repetition of an image like you had with the dog, the dog coming up again and again. By it being repeated, it's knitting the whole thing together in a really satisfying kind of cohesive whole.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Because of the short space a poem allows. Yeah.
And of course, that's what children's stories do. There's lots of repetition, and that's why they're memorable, and why I think children like to hear the same stories over and over again.
I'd like to just read to you a comment in the chat room. It's from Judith, and it says, Larry, I never know where you may lead me when your poem begins. It's always an adventure. I often laugh, sometimes cry, as in what we did yesterday. Thank you for being my favorite poet.
Thank you. That's from Judy?
Yes.
I assume it's my wife.
Aw, that's so sweet. Well, I do want to again thank everyone for joining us. And Larry, thank you for reading for us. It has been wonderful. If anyone has any final questions, we do have a few more moments.
Yeah, Wendy, I just had one comment, about this the difference between the novels. So I read a lot of spy and crime genre and watch a lot of it on TV. So whenever that happens, I'm always like, okay, I heard that plot before. I'm running all these plot threads through my head. When I read a poem, I can't filter it. I just have to immerse myself in it. That's what I love about poetry, is that it takes me away on a journey. I can't say I heard this plot before. I just have to go along for the ride. That's what I love about poetry.
Great. We have another few minutes, or maybe can I end with one final poem?
Please, that would be lovely. Thank you.
It's actually from an earlier book, a book called Mistaking Each Other for Ghosts. And short poem for my wife, Judy. And the poem is called What I Should Tell You More Often. If I couldn't hear your voice, no other voice. Listen to this, Ben. If I couldn't listen to your breath as you sleep, how would I know I was still breathing? How could I open my eyes to receive the day? If we forget the same story, what time takes from us, it takes from us both. But if you weren't to return to this room, why would I draw the curtains to divide one darkness from another? Why would I need to make that distinction? What we see together each morning without surprise, how quickly would it vanish? Those stones in the garden adding up to a wall, and the grass that has learned where it must end, and the flowers whose names only you have tried to teach me. Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you.
Bravo. Let me read one final comment and question from the chat box from Peter Filkins. Complimenting you on a wonderful reading, and also asking the last question: how do you think your poems have changed over the years?
They've gotten better. I think they've gotten more interested to re-quote myself from the beginning. I think they've gotten more interested in spoken voices, in tones of voice, in what can be done through a story. And I think that's what interests me a lot at the moment, is how people can speak in the poem. And again, I guess I'd say there's a lot that in that I have learned from Robert Frost, even though I don't think my poems are like Frost's at all. I think that's an element of Frost's work, how to work through people, and how therefore to lure a reader into the fabric of lives and the fabric of poems without coming out and saying, this is what I believe, this is what you should believe. So reading a poem becomes then an act of discovery for the reader. That's what I hope my poems will be.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our audience.
Yeah.
A recording of today's program will be available on the Stockbridge Library's YouTube channel. And if you go to stockbridgelibrary.org and click on the little box that says, in case you missed it, the recording will be there. And we'll be back next week with more poetry for you. Larry, thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, John.
No, Lawrence, thank you. Beautiful. Very nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.